I sat in silence. This silence grew louder with every passing second. Details of the room sharpened in the space between words. The clock seemed to tick louder as time dragged itself achingly forward. My crossed leg bounced erratically, filling the space that was empty where conversation should have lived. It grew heavier between two strangers who had been brought together by the slow machinery and purgatory NHS waiting list. A shaft of light cut across the room like a glass wall separating us. Dust drifted slowly through this beam. I watched the particles fall, studying their quiet descent as my mind wrestled with this growing sense of futility. I had the distinct impression that the therapist had very little desire to be in the room, and that the only thing separating him from wages and his lunch break was me. I returned to his eyes. They were flat and distant, their aperture blurry. My brain automatically scanned for rejection, hypervigilance, the operating system of my childhood. "Do you enjoy your job?" I asked as buoyantly as possible. His eyes shifted back into focus. He sighed quietly and shrugged, and I could see his eyes reaching for the heavens, but he caught them before they could rise. "I see," I said, nodding. We returned to silence. "What would you like me to talk about?" I asked. "What would you like to talk about?" he replied. Typical therapist question for a question response. "I don't know," I said, staring at the ceiling, searching my brain for an answer. "Talking about my feelings, it doesn't really help me, you know." "Why are you here then?" he asked, almost accusingly. "I was referred," I replied. "My mental health nurse said that this could help." He didn't respond, and the silence returned. The air of his conceit filled the room, and from this I was resolute not to break the silence once again. 20 minutes passed, I left, I never saw him again. And that experience forced me to confront this question: what if therapy isn't built for men? Chapter 1. The Therapeutic Model. The core assumption of many therapeutic models is that psychological problems arise from unresolved trauma and maladaptive behavioural patterns. The therapist's role is to bring these problems into conscious awareness through dialogue and emotional exploration. Imagine the therapist as a real estate agent guiding you through your own house. As she describes each room, the way you see them changes forever. She may even reveal rooms you never knew existed. In practice, therapy emphasizes conversation, introspection. Modern therapy assumes that psychological healing occurs primarily through verbal emotional processing. Yet many men integrate their psyche not through words, but through action, responsibility, and symbolic engagement with the world. Verbal expression does not always fit the masculine temperament. Research suggests that men display higher rates of alexithymia, that is, difficulty identifying and articulating emotional states, which makes dialogue-centered therapy particularly challenging for them. For many men, the energy spent analysing emotions in the therapy chair may be better directed towards building competence, confronting challenges, engaging in real-world pursuits that naturally foster psychological development. Carl Jung hinted at this dynamic when he wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering." In this sense, neurosis may often arise not merely from unresolved trauma, but from unlived potential. The unconscious seeks expression through action, creativity, and symbolic engagement with life. For many men, transformation therefore emerges not from endless introspection with a directionless pursuit, but from responsibility, mastery, and confrontation with the real world. That means no screens. Many men do not naturally process emotional conflict through language. Instead, they engage the world directly. competence, exploration, responsibility for family, and the trials and tribulations that temper one's character in the fires of suffering. These experiences shape and transform the psyche in ways that analysis alone cannot achieve. It is also worth recognising the institutional structure surrounding modern therapy. Is it not in the contemporary world that many industries are ultimately driven by financial incentives? Any system funded through prolonged engagement carries an inherent tendency to perpetuate its own necessity. Jung believed that psychological development does not occur solely through analysis, but through the lived process of individuation, confronting reality, assuming responsibility, and allowing unconscious forces to express themselves through action and creativity. Mastery of a craft, endurance in the face of adversity, the building of an empire, the building of entrepreneurial businesses, the engagement with the challenges of life become powerful engines for psychological metamorphosis. When psychological struggle is confined to language alone, the process of individuation can be weakened. Real-world action, responsibility, creation, and confrontation with reality remains the most powerful catalyst for psychological development and for the evolution of the human spirit. Chapter 2. Psychology of the masculine spirit. The taxi moved slowly through the morning traffic, carrying me deeper into London. I'd come to enjoy these quiet journeys. It was one of the few moments where I could sit alone with my thoughts. The dull fatigue of the morning would slowly dissipate. Youth has a strange power. It allows the body to recover quickly from transgressions of the weekend. In the single evening that separates Sunday from Monday, one was almost feeling whole again. However, this weekend had been different. I had spent it spiralling into that abyssal void I had come to call home. My life had begun to feel like a sequence of evanescent despair. Ordinary life appeared to exist behind a veil, like something I could clearly see but never quite feel. The moment I passed through heavy security doors of the school, I was summoned immediately to the psychiatric office. The irony of those doors was not lost on me. Their purpose was not to keep danger out, but to keep people in. I walked through the corridors in a haze. This labyrinth was led by a nurse, and my disassociation made everything feel like a long-lost daydream. In those days, life was a synopsis, not a novel. I entered the office and sat down, bracing myself for whatever disappointment this particular human was about to afflict on me. "Ah, yes," he said, looking up. "John, how are we today?" His mouse clicked a few times, and I already knew what that meant. He had forgotten me, or at least everything except face and name. "Okay," I replied flatly, with the same level of detail most teenagers offer to adults who ask questions they are not prepared to hear answered. His eyes widened suddenly, and I realised he had just read the report. "Oh," he said, leaning back in his chair with a sigh. "I see we had a little incident this weekend." A familiar feeling returned to me. Yes, that desolate sensation. Like a Mars rover slowly trailing across a distant planet, waiting for its battery to expire. I said nothing. "Well," he continued casually, "this little mini overdose isn't really anything to make a fuss about, is it?" His eyes weighed me in that peculiar way adults do when they suspect you may not be entirely dedicated to your own self-destruction. He studied my face. I deliberately held my micro-expression still and examined the pattern of the carpet instead. In that moment, something became clear to me. Something I had already begun to suspect, that no matter the institution, no matter the language, no matter the declarations of professional care, There were no safe spaces, and the descent has no floor. The subtle mockery in his tone was not lost to me. In the contrary, I searched for it. I focused on it with the hunger of an anoretic study in a forbidden food. "I'll increase your fluoxetine," he said casually, clicking his pen, putting it in his drawer. "That way you won't have any more of these little attempts, yes?" A strange feeling come over me. An enormous desire to diminish my presence so completely that I could dissolve, perhaps into the dark matter of the universe, to exist and yet not exist, but beyond that reach of human eyes, in that liminal space, alone and perhaps forgotten. And I noticed something else. The room felt strangely familiar. It mirrored my childhood home, a place where weakness was punished. I nodded slowly and stared at a tree through the window, studying its leaves as it quivered against the wind in their futility, their resistance against the end, similar to mine. I sighed inwardly, my juvenile model of the world vindicated once more. To be honest, I was terrified. Terrified it was going to be this way my whole life, and the words of my deceased father came to me saying, "Gets worse as you get older, son. It gets worse." I was 13. It was in moments like this that I first began to accrue unconscious material around therapy in men. Back then I was too young to hold its weight in my hands. I was unable to overturn it and articulate its colour. And 2 decades later, it has resulted in this very video. The psychology of the masculine spirit differs from the feminine in many ways. They're not enemies, despite culture's claim, but complements, yin and yang, with the same human drama. Men, when presented with a problem, instinctively begin constructing solutions. When a partner begins describing a difficulty, many men, myself included, start designing strategies before the sentence has even reached its finish. A problem my wife will certainly lay testament to. But often the problem does not require a solution. What is wanted is something much more human and simpler. To be heard, understood, met with compassion, dare I say, for the particular brand of suffering they have, to be validated, a small nod, hand on the shoulder, a tut here or there. And yet us humans will repel suffering at all costs, even the suffering of others. Indeed, suffering may irritate some people too. Those whom life hasn't been flattened by that black freight train of tribulation yet. The irony here is that if we spent just those few precious minutes comforting others, it would directly resource that will of which was required to endure. When that need is unmet, people search for substitutes. This may particularly explain why so many now turn to artificial companions, sadly, even chatbots as therapists, not because their machines are wiser than humans, but because they offer something increasingly rare: patience, compassion. Yes, it is void in this culture of ours, an emptiness of our age. We don't particularly like each other, truth be told. We don't even like ourselves. Unisex dropout rates from therapy range from about 20 to 46% across studies, and among 44.8% drop out and 26% attend only one session only. The most effective therapy for men seems to be behavioural focused, as this has action-based goals and can see clear improvement. It is also difficult to express reservations about the therapist you currently see. It is routinely labelled as transference. Of course, I had to practice restraint and not deploy their own wordy weapons and claim they were gaslighting me, unfortunately. Therapy language is full of loaded words and dogma, so I resisted. But more often than not, polypharmacy is deployed after a series of questions designed to locate symptoms that are problematic for society. So often people go into therapy when another party is not happy with the person's behaviour. How often a therapist is seen as yet just another authority for the patient to have to evade and manoeuvre around. Of course, profound suffering usually has roots in theological depths, something culture avoids entirely. Therapy is inept in this domain. Let's be honest. The reframing of narratives in its worldly philosophy and direction is completely silent. This is what many people seek and why they find themselves in such dark waters with Hadal depths below, and this small lifeboat of antidepressants and breathing exercises to keep them afloat in the storm that is life. Indeed, therapy was not designed with men in mind. Fortunately, some models are now developing male-adapted therapy models. Traditional masculinity values stoicism, competitiveness, independence, and competence. Of course, any value pushed to extremes can have negative effects, but it seems that therapy culture deems most of these as pathologies. These traits have historically helped men survive and sometimes are interpreted in therapy as purely dysfunction. Men's fault lines aren't conventional, such as crying, sadness, anxiety, and withdrawal. On the contrary, men typically express themselves externally: irritability, risk-taking, substance abuse, anger. The ubiquitous post-breakup gym bro motivational arc we all know so well on this side of the internet. This energetic negativity is a classic use of using symptoms, and therapy was built around the internal kind. We need to move beyond symptom reduction via lining the pockets of the pharmaceutical industry, beyond the mere extermination of undesired behaviour and the democratically elected diagnoses that change given what decade you're in of the DSM. Indeed, male suffering is so often nihilistic and existential in nature. So where is the distance between human problems and a medical pathology? If our house is destroyed in a hurricane, our correct response is sadness, despair, and anger. And if we were to need every drop of that energy to secure our family's safety, male suffering often does not look like sadness. It looks like anger and addiction and withdrawal and risk. So we are often deemed not suffering, but simply bad people. The question becomes, what behaviour needs correcting, rather than what happened to you? The animal spirit is particularly sensitive to hierarchy, I must add. For this reason, shame-based therapy is often counterproductive. If you want men to, air quote, behave, framing their suffering as weakness does not resolve the problem, it exacerbates it. Shame does not civilize the wounded masculine spirit, it corrodes it. The most dangerous people in the world are often the most deeply hurt. History gives us brutal examples of this. Consider the devastation unleashed by Genghis Khan, whose conquest led to the deaths of tens of millions. The infamous red and black tents outside cities that gave the doomed future its colour. Yet the origins of that violence did not begin with conquest, they began with humiliation. As a boy, Temujin, the child who would later become Genghis Khan, watched his father murdered by rival tribes. With the patriarch gone, the clan abandoned the family entirely, usurping his throne and khanship. His mother and siblings were cast out onto the Mongolian steppe to survive alone. A brutal wilderness, indeed. They lived on wild roots, berries and small animals. In that brutal struggle for survival, Temujin even killed his own half-brother, as he suspected he was hiding food. Later, he was captured by a rival tribe, enslaved, publicly humiliated, urinated on, beaten to an inch of his life, forced to wear a wooden collar around his neck like an animal in the cages below. In a world governed by honour and hierarchy, such experiences carved deep wounds into the psyche. Who knows what he was plotting in the depths of those prisons? When Temujin eventually escaped with an inch of his life, by gathering power, he did so with a relentless obsession with loyalty and domination. He was revolutionary in the way he brought certain men up. It did not matter of what breed they were, skin colour, language, ethnicity. It was a brutal meritocracy, and where only the best rose. Betrayal was punished without mercy, I might add. Entire cities devastated and destroyed. The wounded boy returned into the world as a force of unimaginable violence. Indeed, some historians even suggest that he reduced the planet's carbon dioxide by the sheer amount of death he caused. The point is not to excuse brutality, it's to understand this psychological truth. Humiliation breeds monsters. Male suffering often does not look like sadness. As I said before, it's revenge, domination, destruction, the conquering of an empire. It mutates, and when it mutates, consequences become catastrophic. In my own country, the United Kingdom, narratives about male suffering are constantly being produced, I might add. In advertising, in the civil courts, men are routinely dismissed as parents. And increasingly, such as the film like Adolescence, portray the wounded masculine psyche as something inherently dangerous, something to be managed, neutralised, mocked. But the problem may not be that men refuse help. It may be that the language of their suffering is different. When distress appears as anger, risk, or silence rather than sadness, how often is it misunderstood? And when suffering is misunderstood, it doesn't heal, it deepens. Strength can become domination. Competence can become arrogance. Independence can become isolation. And of course, the masculine spirit is no exception. The pathology of the masculine does not arise from masculinity itself, but from its corruption. When the animus is wounded, humiliated, and stripped of meaning, its energy does not dissipate. It deepens and seeks another outlet. Masculine psychology is profoundly shaped by hierarchy, purpose, and recognition. For centuries, men organised themselves around structures, competence and tribes, armies, guilds and institutions. Status within these hierarchies was not mere social decoration, it was psychological orientation. It told a man where he stood in the world. But when these structures collapsed or become inaccessible, the masculine spirit becomes disorientated. A man without purpose does not simply become calm and passive, more often he becomes restless. The energy remains, and now it has nowhere constructive to go. When masculine energy is deprived of meaningful direction, it begins to seek unconscious recognition through darker avenues. Violence, domination, resentment, and nihilism are not the origins of the wounded masculine spirit, they are its symptoms. This is the pathology. The masculine spirit and psyche is not merely orientated toward comfort or emotional equilibrium. As Dostoevsky says, give them food and only the means to propagate their own species and see if they won't cut themselves in boredom. It is orientated towards challenge, responsibility, and purpose. Remove these structures and the psychological machinery begins to malfunction. The result is a strange paradox of the modern world. Many men today possess more material comfort than any generation before them. Yet they experience unprecedented levels of disorientation and despair. When masculine energy cannot build, it will destroy. And when it cannot destroy outwardly, how often it turns inward? Addiction, isolation, self-sabotage, violence against the selves. Are men not the most likely to take their own lives in this age? These are not simply moral failures, they are often the signs of a psyche that has lost its orientation. To understand the pathology of the masculine, we must first recognize a difficult truth. The masculine spirit requires struggle, hierarchy, and meaning to remain psychologically healthy. When these disappear, pathology begins. Everything that is shunned retreats back into the void of the shadow. Yet these forces are never truly exterminated, they simply become unconscious and begin to move in ways unknown, like the depths of the catacombs beneath the feet of people of Paris. As Carl Jung warned, the psychological rule is that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens, and we call it fate. The shadow does not disappear when ignored, it merely descends beneath the surface of the psyche, and it moves silently through unseen corridors. And like the buried bones beneath Paris, what lies beneath the ground does not cease to exist simply because the city above chooses not to look. What is rejected by its consciousness does not die. It waits, gathers strength, and when it finally returns, it rarely does so gently. The most dangerous pathology of the masculine spirit is not violence, it's nihilism. Violence, at least, still contains energy. It is a distorted attempt to assert meaning through force. Nihilism is something far, far colder. It is the quiet conviction that nothing matters at all and we are only specks in an indifferent universe. A man who believes nothing matters cannot be persuaded by morality, compassion, or shame. Those languages presuppose meaning. Nihilism rejects the very foundation on which they stand. This condition rarely begins with philosophy, it begins with humiliation. When effort brings no recognition, when sacrifice yields no dignity, and when suffering is interpreted only as weakness, the masculine psyche begins to withdraw its belief in the world. Structures that once gave orientation, hierarchy, and purpose, they dissolve. What remains is not peace, it is emptiness. Emptiness is not a neutral state. The human psyche cannot tolerate it for long. When meaning collapses, men do not simply sit quietly in the void. Oh no. They begin searching for something, anything, powerful enough to replace it. Sometimes the search leads to addiction. Sometimes to resentment. Other times, destruction. History repeatedly shows that nihilistic men are among the most dangerous forces in human affairs, not because they are strong, but because they no longer believe anything is worth preserving. And when nothing is worth preserving, everything is permissible. Nihilism is not merely a philosophical position, it is a psychological collapse. The pathology of the masculine does not begin with violence, it begins with disorientation. When the hierarchy collapses, dignity is stripped away, suffering is interpreted as weakness, and the masculine psyche begins to fracture. What should we have integrated retreats into shadow, and what should have been given meaning decays into resentment. Eventually the structure that once orientated the man towards the world dissolves entirely. What remains is nihilism, and nihilism is not merely despair. Oh no, it is the psychological condition in which nothing is worth building, nothing is worth preserving, and therefore nothing is worth restraining. Tear it all down, as they say. In the vacuum that the masculine spirit does not disappear, it mutates. Apathy, addiction, destruction, pathology of the masculine. And not masculinity itself, its core self, but what emerges when its energies are humiliated by a culture and disorientated, left without purpose. Chapter 4. The restoration of the masculine spirit. In ancient Sparta, boys were not simply told to behave, they were initiated. At the age of 7, they were taken from the comfort of their household and placed into the agoge, a system of training that was much psychological as it was physical. Hardship was not considered cruelty, but preparation. The hunger, cold, and exhaustion, and discipline were all deliberate features of the process. This process was so brutal that if you did not come home at all, then you was considered not strong enough to be a man in their world. The purpose was not merely to produce soldiers, it was to transform boys into men who possess resilience, loyalty, and a clear place within the hierarchy of their society. Spartan initiation recognized something modern cultures often forget. The masculine spirit does not mature through comfort alone, it matures through trial, responsibility, and recognition. Without initiation, energy becomes chaos. Without structure, the search for meaning can easily collapse into resentment or nihilism. The Spartans understood that if a society does not provide a path for the transformation of boys into men, that transformation will occur anyway, but often in the darker recesses of society. You see, men are not made in the flattened competitions where no one loses and everybody wins. They are made when the world pushes against them and they push back. It is the fading darkness of the night on the horizon, the snarl of the wolf, the pit in your stomach crying out in hunger, fear, anxiety, anger. These emotions are not meant to be pharmacologically eliminated. They are the ancient signals of struggle and the necessary preludes to victory. For tribulation is the fire of transformation. Remember, the phoenix had to die before it could raise itself from the ashes. How far have we strayed from the needs of our own nature? Our society now treats competition as toxic, ambition as vulgar, and strength as abusive. Yet how can a boy live when everything he feels within himself has been declared a pathology? Modern societies have largely abandoned initiation. Today, the few places where it still survives are found only in narrow avenues: the military, certain clubs, and increasingly in online spaces. They are the fringes of society, the margins where boys still attempt to become men. Unfortunately, many of these avenues serve the purposes of the institution rather than the individual. The military, that would use the young as cannon fodder, and the young shall die as the elder men shall argue. Yet even these narrow margins grow rarer, and many have become ideologically captured. Trust in our institutions has eroded. Ever since 2020, things have been going downhill for the governments and institutions of the world. They're viewed with suspicion as the Epstein files validate every conspiracy theory for the last 2 decades. The structures that once offered guidance and legitimacy have been exposed as fragile, corrupt, or outright satanic. What remains is a generation suspended in prolonged adolescence. Our lives resemble a kind of Peter Pan theatre that never ends. Adults in age, yet often denied the responsibilities that once marked adulthood. Many live without the means to establish homes of their own, even less to form families. Fewer form families, fewer raise children. Roles that once provided meaning and direction are increasingly framed as instruments of patriarchal control. Fatherhood is portrayed not as a duty, but a heavy burden. And some government legislation rewards the single mother rather than rewarding the family unit financially. In some corners of modern thought, the idea of bringing a new life into the world is treated as immoral. Antinatalists argue that reproducing the human species is unethical in a world they believe is destined for fire and collapse. And so the path from boyhood to man becomes increasingly obscure. Our unconscious searches for surrogate initiation. It has led us into vapid gym culture, self-identified online tribes that war endlessly on Twitter, ideological movements that promise orientation and give further destabilization, even radicalization. We are led ultimately to the words of Nietzsche: "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how," and how desperately we claw for that why. For the purgatory of nihilism is something the human soul cannot endure for long. When meaning collapses, the spirit begins to starve. Our spiritual philosophies have become destitute, barren as the Antarctic plains, vast dead zones, incapable of sustaining the human life who walks across them. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And yet we have become a generation of men who have forgotten who we are. We wander from blind guide to blind guide, searching for direction in a world drowning in information, but starving for wisdom. We search for the needle, and all we are given is more and more digital haystacks. As the Apostle Paul warned many years ago, always learning and yet never able to come to an accurate knowledge of truth. And so I ask you, dear reader, is meaning something that can be prescribed? If it cannot be administered in a clinic, nor manufactured by institutions, meaning must be discovered through struggle, responsibility, and the confrontation with reality itself. The masculine spirit does not require humiliation nor sedation, it requires purpose. For when a man possesses a reason to endure, he can withstand almost any suffering. But when that reason disappears, he lives in suffering. You hear about these in the news all the time. The crisis of the modern masculine is not merely psychological, it is existential. A generation of men searching for meaning in a world that has forgotten how to provide it. And when it does provide, it is only commodified. And until that meaning is rediscovered, the restless spirit of man will continue its search, sometimes in creation, sometimes in destruction, but always in the pursuit of the same ancient question. We look up to the sky and we whisper, why?